Hello.
Good
Welcome,
evening.
everyone. Good evening. Thank you, and welcome to the 2022 annual meeting of the Henry Sheldon Museum, including an exciting talk by our guest speaker, Christopher Ilstrup, which we'll hear from later. But first, we will proceed with our business portion of the annual meeting. And I'm Lucinda Cockrell, the president of the Board of Trustees of the Henry Sheldon Museum. And now I call this meeting to order. So a special welcome and thank you to all of our museum members and friends who are joining us today. These last few years have presented unique challenges and brought many changes, but the Sheldon's continued success could not have been possible without our members. And that means you. We are extremely grateful to you, and that you find it in the space within your heart and your budgets to assist the museum, which allows us then to fulfill our mission in making the many varied programs, events, services very successful that we've had this past year. And this year we've done a bit of house cleaning to accommodate new faces on staff. And in helping to do that, we've added to our museum archives many brochures and flyers and posters, advertisements of things that were produced by the museums in the past, the history of the museum itself, basically. And as you know, the museum was begun by Henry Sheldon and his eclectic collecting in the mid-19th century. And it was incorporated as a community museum in 1882. And what has struck me going through all these different pieces of ephemera is that the Sheldon Museum has always been community-oriented. That's been the connecting thread. Here's an early brochure that maybe you can see it. I don't know, it's kind of bright. It has this tagline, oldest incorporated village museum in the United States. It's got a whole bunch of information, no real photographs, but lots of drawings and so forth about everything that you can see in the house. And all through it, it's been tied to the village, i.e. the community. It shares the stories that are waiting to be found within its objects, its artifacts, the art, documents, manuscripts, audio, and the digital collections, which continues on today. The Sheldon Museum is indeed our unique community treasure, and we will continue to be relevant and meaningful as our vision and interpretation progresses, thanks to our staff, our Board of Trustees, and members like you. And speaking of staff, we have a remarkable staff that accomplishes a great deal and deserves some praise. So please join me in thanking the following people for keeping our Sheldon Museum professional, vibrant, and efficient. Stephanie Skenyon is our executive director. Mary Manley is our associate director. Eva Garcelin Hart is the archivist at the Stuart Swift Research Center. Allison LaCroix is our collections manager. Mary Caron is our bookkeeper, and Suzanne Douglas is our museum shop specialist. Thanks to all the other wonderful volunteers, numerous, and museum at the museum and the research center that are vital to the ongoing functions of this important organization. Now I'd like to introduce our current trustees for the year 2022. Robert Black, Lucinda Cockrell, myself, Ellery Foutch, who is our vice president, Mark Fries, Sylvia Gonzalez, Kelly Hickey, Connor Marinan, Diane Palmeri, who is our treasurer, David Stameshkin, our secretary, and Richard Wing. Thanks to you all. And our honorary trustees are Glenn Andres, Travis Beal Jacobs, Julie Petty, John McCardle Jr., and Cy Tall. And a little bit of voting housekeeping here before we go to our secretary, David. For all voting members and trustees, when voting today on items, please use the raise hand at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions or reactions, use the Q&A to the right of the screen or wherever you may see that. So next, let's move to David Stameshkin, our secretary, for approval of our last year's minutes. David?
Good evening. The 2021 annual meeting minutes have been distributed to you beforehand. Are there any corrections? Seeing none, if there are no corrections, the minutes are approved as distributed. Next, we have the treasurer's report presented by Lucinda Cockrell on behalf of Diane Palmeri, who could not be here with us tonight.
Thank you, David. Bear with me, I will read portions of the treasurer's report. And in addition, the 2022 balance sheet was sent to you on the program agenda and email. So with the fundraising through gifts and grants has been a high priority in 2022. We've had success in raising money to support programming and capital projects. With extremely generous gifts from individuals, private institutions, and state and federal grants, the Henry Sheldon Museum was able to undertake 3 major capital projects, all of which will be completed by the end of 2022 and beginning of 2023. Windows restoration of the Judd Harris House, major elevator renovation, and new energy efficient gas burning boiler. The museum has rolled out a number of motivating fundraising vehicles to appeal to donors with a variety of interests, such as a Trustee Double Your Impact Challenge Match, enhanced membership levels, tiered business memberships, engraved bricks in the garden, an auction, picnic basket and holiday raffles, bought by the barn, concert dance, and live auction. And while the breadth of our innovative new fundraisers this year has attracted and engaged new audiences and donors, the museum has struggled to raise generic operating income this year. We are now most in need of budget relieving monies to support the operating expenses of the museum. Therefore, the annual fund push throughout the end of the year is extremely important for the financial health of the institution. In addition, we rely on spending rule income from the investment funds to provide operating funds to the budget. And due to vagaries of the market this year, the value of the museum's endowment fund is down significantly compared to the high at the end of 2021. Given the high value of the investment funds at the start of 2022, we made the decision to fund the first year of a much needed collections manager position. This is from our gift for current use collections fund held in this account. Funding this position from the investment fund will decrease the value of the account, further reducing the income generated from the principal and increasing the importance of generating budget relieving income. The economic downturn and high inflation experienced in 2022 also resulted in the decision to push plans for a capital campaign into the future. However, we determined that 2 mini campaigns could be launched this year to test the waters for future activity, and we are pleased to report good progress were made on the 2 appeals. The 50th anniversary of the Stuart Swift Research Center with a goal of $50,000, and the William F. Brooks Jr. Education Fund, Endowed Fund for History and Art Education, with a goal of $200,000. Now, thank you. And now our Vice President, Ellery Foutch, will present our outgoing and new trustees. Ellery.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. I'm just getting the text set up here. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. And I would like to recognize First, those Sheldon Museum trustees who have served their terms and will be leaving the Henry Sheldon Museum board. Tonight, we have one such trustee, that's Sylvia Gonzalez. If I may share my screen. Sylvia grew up in Cordoba, Argentina, where she received university degrees in teacher of English as a second language and public translator and interpreter. After arriving in the United States over 30 years ago, she first worked as a junior program officer for the National Endowment for Democracy. She later worked in administration with the Latin American Studies program at Duke University, where she also earned a Master of Arts in Liberal Studies. Sylvia moved to the Middlebury area in 1999 with her husband, Will Pyle, and their two very young sons. She's worked as a volunteer in the local schools, as a classroom helper, fundraiser, volunteer coordinator, Spanish tutor, and reading mentor. She served on and chaired the New Haven School Board for 3 years. For over a decade, she provided organizational support to Middlebury's Youth Soccer Club and served on its board for several terms. She and her husband deliver local Meals on Wheels clients, and Sylvia has also served as on the United Way's Community Impact Funding Grant Committee. We were lucky to have Sylvia join the Sheldon board in 2019, and she's been an energetic, caring, contributing trustee, serving on the executive committee as secretary and on numerous other committees. She's always been ready to help when there's an event, project, program, or other task. She's worked in the archives with collections, fundraising, development, events, as I said, planning, you name it, Sylvia has been there as an active contributor. She's also been a wonderful ambassador for the museum for the mission and opportunities the Sheldon brings to the community. Sylvia, please accept our gratitude for your service and generosity to the Henry Sheldon Museum Board. We appreciate all of your efforts and look forward to still seeing you at member events and programs. I know that if we were all in person, there would be thunderous applause right now, but I hope you'll accept our virtual thanks. I'll hand it over to Lucinda for the next item.
Thank you. And for reasons in which you will see, I would like to recognize those Henry Sheldon Museum trustees who seek to serve a second, third-year term on the board, and that would be Ellery Foutch. And so Dr. Foutch is Associate Professor of American Studies at Middlebury College and now serves as the Board of Trustees Vice President. She has been on our board for 3 years. Her interests, expertise, and talents in teaching material culture and art courses meshes magically with the Sheldon Museum's mission. And during the past 3 years, Ellery has been an impeccable board member, helping out in various capacities whenever needed, serving on multiple committees, and integrating her interesting classwork subjects with the Stuart Swift Research Center materials, Sheldon objects and concepts found within the museum. We're delighted to have her continuing contributions as a board member for a second term. Therefore, I will now entertain a motion to approve the slate of board members seeking re-election to second terms to the Henry Sheldon Museum Board of Trustees.
I so move.
Is there a second? Kelly, yes, I see a second. So it is moved and seconded that the slate of board members seeking one board member re-election to the HSM Board of Trustees be approved as stated. And all those in favor, please say aye or raise your
Aye.
hand. Okay. Any opposed or abstentions? The ayes have it, so thank you. The slate of board members for re-election is approved, and congratulations, Ellery. Right, back to Ellery now for new 2022 board members.
Thank you, Lucinda, and I'll start my screen share again. So as vice president, the bylaws state that the vice president also chairs the nominating committee. So as such, the nominating committee would now like to bring forward the slate of nominees who will each serve a 3-year term on the Henry Sheldon Museum board. Their accomplished and outstanding biographies are posted on the website via our program, which you received in your email tonight, and have been distributed to all of you. So there are two nominees for these 3-year terms, and they are Deborah Evans and Maggie Keith, who you see on the screen. This year, we're also piloting a new initiative for a Middlebury College student representative, which will be a 1-year position on the Board of Trustees without voting, a non-voting position on the board. So I will, and that nominee is Anne Lofgren, who you see on your screen as well. I will now entertain a motion to approve the slate of nominees seeking election to the Henry Sheldon Museum Board of Trustees.
So moved.
Terrific. Do I have a second? It looks like there are in the chat. Super, thank you so much. All those in favor, please raise your hand or use the raise hand function. Thank you. If there are any opposed, and you might need to lower your hand if you just approved.
Yeah.
Okay, it's the ayes have it then. So thank you so much. The slate of nominees is thus approved. Congratulations to our new trustees. I'll stop my screen share here then. Okay, in our next item of business, I would like to present the following slate of officers for consideration by the members. As president, Lucinda Cockrell. As vice president, Ellery Foutch. As secretary, David Stameshkin. And as treasurer, Diane Palmeri. To follow the Robert's Rules of Order phrasing, I will now entertain a motion to approve the slate of officers seeking election to the Henry Sheldon Museum Board of Trustees.
So moved.
And is there a second? I'm seeing in my Q&A. Thanks, Kelly, for being on the spot. It is moved and seconded then that the slate of officers seeking election for the Henry Sheldon Museum Board of Trustees be approved as stated. All those in favor with the raised hand? Terrific. Any opposed? It's nice to see that number count down on the screen. So the ayes have it. Thank you. The slate of officers is approved, and congratulations to our executive committee. And that concludes my business. It's now my pleasure to introduce our executive director, Stephanie Skenyon, who will present the Sheldon's Year in Review for 2022. Take it away, Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. This is a fantastic opportunity, and I really appreciate being given it here. My greetings to the Sheldon Museum's many members, friends, donors, benefactors, and trustees on this lovely December evening. I am improving the number of sweaters in my wardrobe as we speak here. I have had the good fortune to meet many of you, but to some of you, I'm likely still a new face. My name is Stephanie Skenyon, and I'm very pleased to serve the Henry Sheldon Museum as executive director. 2022 was the Henry Sheldon Museum's year of community, and it has certainly been an exciting time. I'm sure many of you have visited our new exhibitions or have joined us for our exceptional programs. And I'd like to present to you some of the most important highlights as we close out this year and look forward to 2023. The Henry Sheldon Museum's dedication to the preservation and care for and of its remarkable collection of material objects and works on paper forms the bedrock of its mission and its institutional history. In 2022, the museum offered a variety of new exhibitions presented in the spirit of its year of community, while at the same time, the challenges it faces as a collections-focused institution. In 2020, a webbing clothes moth infestation was discovered affecting the museum's extensive collection of textiles stored in a dedicated space on the 3rd floor of the famous Judd Harris House. The museum's staff and volunteers immediately sprung into action, contracting expert consultants and developing short, medium, and longer-term plans to successfully address this issue. Throughout this past year, the museum staff, Middlebury College Museum Works interns, and work study students have painstakingly examined the textile collection, sealed affected articles, and subjected them to a 3-week freezing cycle in a specially dedicated chest freezer in the basement of the Harris House. More than half of the affected collection is now ready to be meticulously vacuumed before the objects are returned to textile storage. While any pest infestation can be dangerous for textiles, the museum's staff and volunteers must be applauded for their efforts ensuring that Henry Sheldon's collection will be available to visitors and researchers for generations to come. This year, the Henry Sheldon Museum has been selected to participate in the Collections Assessment for Preservation, or CAP program. This competitive grant provides small and mid-sized museums with partial funding towards a general conservation assessment, including a study of all of the institution's collections, buildings, and building systems, as well as its policies and procedures relating to collections care. Assessors who specialize in collections and buildings will visit the museum in coming months in order to create a customized assessment report with prioritized recommendations to improve collections care. The CAP program will help the Sheldon Museum better preserve and more effectively store its collection, continue the institution's valuable mission. The Henry Sheldon Museum presented several new exhibitions in 2022 and welcomed back one of its special holiday traditions. These exhibitions include Elephant in the Archives, Silences, Erasures, and Relevance. This exhibition, developed by Eva Garcelon-Hart, the museum's archivist, and Taylor Rossini, collections specialist and general museum extraordinaire, examined the Henry Sheldon Museum's archive with a modern, critical eye. How does the selection of sources for preservation emphasize certain people, places, and events while simultaneously silencing others? Who decides what sources are preserved, and how do decisions about preservation reflect bias? How should we, the archivists, historians, and researchers of today, assemble a collection of objects and works on paper truly representative of our community for the future? Using maps, photographs, and ephemera, this exhibit attempts to answer these questions as they apply to the Henry Sheldon Museum's archive. Casting a critical eye upon the Sheldon's archival collection can help us better understand how items were selected for preservation at different times across the museum's history, and will challenge us to make better, more inclusive choices that represent our contemporary community. Addison County collects and Addison County kids collect. Are you a collector? This is the question that Mary Manley, Associate Director at the Henry Sheldon Museum, asked Addison County residents, and she was overwhelmed by the response. Addison County Collects features objects on loan from 36 different local collectors, featuring a remarkably diverse range of art, images, textiles, and ceramics hailing from 6 continents. Exhibition labels reflect the collector's unique perspective on the significance of each item and what it means to be a collector today. Addison County Collects is accompanied by a photo exhibition, Addison County Kids Collect, featuring Addison County's youngsters posing with their personal collections, including Caleb's very impressive collection of John Deere tractors and Adler's collection of fire engines. Addison County Collects and Addison County Kids Collect brings together members of our local community in the spirit of museum founder and collector Henry Sheldon. Artists in the Archives, Community History and Collage. This past September, the museum welcomed this new innovative exhibition focused on the intersection of history and art. Eva Garcelon-Hart and Taylor Rossini worked with guest curator Rick Cassini-Cador of the Collage Institute. Collage artists from all over the world, providing access to the museum's archival collection to facilitate the creation of a series of 24 collages, tackling subjects that are challenging, like race and gender, nature, food, social connection, and industry in their works, reflecting specifically upon the idea of community in the 21st century. This exhibit has been generously supported by the Walter Surf Community Fund. And returning for this year, holiday trains are rolling down the tracks again at the Henry Sheldon Museum. The elaborate Lionel train layout is an annual tradition delighting all ages. The assemblage stands 3 levels high with tracks running Lionel O gauge trains, Lionel O27 gauge trains, and an upper track featuring HO trains. The layout includes a backdrop of the Green Mountains painted by local artist Gail Braisted, an operating gondola ski lift, skiers, snowboarders, rock climbers, and bicyclists. Henry Sheldon Museum is very pleased to be able to open this exhibition to the public without limitations on visitor numbers this holiday season. And we hope you'll soon stop by for a peek at the famous Caboose View camp. Henry Sheldon Museum offered a wide variety of new innovative programming in 2022, hosted in person in old and new venues, and digitally in webinars presented online. The museum's programs were in many ways inspired by the institution's collections, its exhibits, and most importantly, the many communities of which it is a part. Henry Sheldon Museum is profoundly grateful to its generous donors and benefactors, the IPJ Realty, the Walter Sir Community Foundation, to Vermont Humanities, and to Table 21 for supporting its various public programs in 2022. The Henry Sheldon Museum presented 2 interrelated series of digital webinars convening scholars, cultural visionaries, curators, and artists from the United States and the wider international community. The Elephant in the Room series, I put that too quickly. The Elephant in the Room series, the inspiration for the exhibition of the same name, presented monthly webinars specifically designed to interrogate issues of inclusion and exclusion and the politics of preservation in order to initiate conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in museum practice. And our many thanks to Vermont Humanities for supporting this program. Beginning this past fall, and extending into the spring of next year, the museum presents a webinar series focused on and inspired by the issues reflected in the work of collage artists exhibited in Artists in the Archives, Community History, and Collage. These are supported by the Walter Sir Community Foundation. The first webinars have been a roaring success, and the museum looks forward to its upcoming offerings in the series, including, and don't miss it, Artists in the Archives, Women in the Archives on Wednesday, December 14th at 7 p.m. The Henry Sheldon Museum's garden space, lovingly maintained by the Middlebury Garden Club, provided a bright, inviting site for several of the institution's programs and events in 2022, and many of these were supported by independent donations and by Table 21. The museum welcomed the local community to 2 exhibition openings in June and September, to a summer concert series in August, to its first annual Bop by the Barn and auction in October. In the historic barn, the museum offered a series of in-person talks designed to raise awareness of the museum's moth mitigation efforts and a series of presentations by local collectors contributing to the Addison County Collects exhibition. The Sheldon Garden plays a central role in the local community, and the community will most certainly be engaged in a wider discussion about post-garden renovation, a project currently in its infancy, in order to ensure this space is inclusive and accessible in the future. The Henry Sheldon Museum is pleased to have initiated new programs for local families and children in partnership with the Vermont Children's Museum and the Ellery Library in 2022. The Vermont Children's Museum offered origami box making workshops under the tent in the museum garden. And local artist, pictured here, Gene Childers, presented his engaging Make a Bug workshop at the Ellery Library in October, an activity supported by Table 21. These activities and the partnerships that made them possible were a smashing success, and the museum looks forward to cultivating these opportunities next year. The Henry Sheldon Museum's Stuart Swift Research Center celebrated its 50th anniversary this year, a remarkable milestone. Many researchers, teachers, authors, and archivists offered heartfelt testimony to the significant role that the Research Center has played and continues to play, documenting the history of Addison County at a reception in the Sheldon Garden in July. In addition to Research Center-focused exhibitions like the Elephant in the Archives and Artists in the Archives, the history of this remarkable institution is featured in a special exhibition, Archiving History, the Stuart Swift Research Center at 50, currently on view in the museum and online. The museum continues to celebrate the Research Center's 50th anniversary with its 50 for 50 campaign, a fundraising drive set to raise $50,000 to support the center, its remarkable collection, its exhibitions, and its programming. The Henry Sheldon Museum enthusiastically joined the local communities to celebrate Halloween, offering a talk by Dr. Linus Owens at the Ilsley Library and a tour of West Cemetery led by David Munford. Spooky Night at the Museum, a revival of last year's popular event, was a bone-chilling success, featuring ghost stories, tarot card readings, and a make-your-own murder scene dollhouse. This December, the museum welcomed over 350 visitors to its holiday open house. Over 160 visitors made the Sheldon's Museum store a destination of choice during the most recent midnight stroll. The museum will be open late from 5 until 8 p.m. for the next 2 midnight strolls on Thursday, December 8th and Thursday, December 15th, respectively. And don't forget the holiday trains will be running until January 7th. The museum thanks Table 21 for sponsoring its Halloween programs and its holiday open house. As Lucinda has already mentioned, the Henry Sheldon Museum's buildings, particularly its historic Judd Harris House, ensure its central place in the local community, and the institution has tackled several physical maintenance projects beginning in 2021 and extending into this year. The preservation of its structures and of its collection very much depends upon effective climate control. And the museum continued to pursue a multi-phase heating and cooling project this year with the removal of 2 end-of-life Smith oil-fired furnaces and their replacement with a single new energy-efficient gas boiler, 5 air handlers with cooling coils. The museum also ensured equitable accessibility to its exhibitions, completing repairs to its elevator before opening its doors to the public in the summer of 2022. The restoration of the museum windows, an ongoing project, entered its final phase in November this year and will be complete at the latest by March of 2023. And our thanks to Jeff Bellinger of Willard Street Traditions for all of his hard work. It's really been absolutely exceptional. The museum thanks the Warner Fletcher Foundation, the Vermont Arts Council, the Osprey Fund, the Alma Gibbs Donchen Foundation, the 1772 Foundation, the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation, and the many extraordinarily generous donors and friends who made the completion of these essential projects possible. The Henry Sheldon Museum, like any other vibrant institution, witnesses its fair share of comings and goings, and 2021 and 2022 were no exception to the rule. The museum offered a fond farewell to 2 of its long-standing staff members, Taylor Rossini and Bill Brooks. Taylor Rossini originally joined the Henry Sheldon Museum while still a student at Middlebury College, and her many talents were immediately recognized by the institution's staff and volunteers. Taylor served as an archival assistant, as a collections associate, and she later stepped in as grant writer and did a million other things as well. This is just very reductive. Taylor contributed to all the Sheldon's 2022 exhibitions, and she was a keystone in the development and facilitation of the Artists in the Archives exhibition. Taylor was accepted to the prestigious winter graduate program and began her studies this past summer. The museum's staff, volunteers, members, and friends wish Taylor well as she proceeds to her next educational and professional steps, and we look forward to hearing about her research, her discoveries, and her progress in years to come. In December 2021, the museum bid a very fond farewell to its longtime executive director and pillar of the community, Bill Brooks. Bill grew up in Washington, D.C., where he was exposed to art and museums, and he later attended Kenyon College. Bill pursued a career in banking, but he never forgot his passion for folk art and completed a master's degree in American Folk Art Studies through New York University and the American Folk Art Museum. Bill's work at Frog Hollow Craft Gallery and the Coolidge Foundation, where he served as development director, eventually led him to the Henry Sheldon Museum in 2012. Bill's education in both art and history was a perfect fit for the institution. He led the institution successfully for nearly 10 years, building relationships with donors, with artists, and with the local community. In honor of Bill's remarkable contribution to the Henry Sheldon Museum, the museum incorporated the William F. Brooks Jr. Endowed Fund for History and Art Education in 2022. I offer my thanks to Bill Brooks for his dedication to the continuation and promotion of the museum's mission. And I extend my gratitude to the many donors and friends who have contributed so generously to the Brooks Endowed Fund. The Henry Sheldon Museum was very pleased to welcome 2 new faces to the staff this year, myself as executive director, and Allison LaCroix in October as our new collections manager. I had just finished my PhD in history at the University of Miami when I discovered the Henry Sheldon Museum search for a new executive. And I was immediately attracted to the institution's unique collection, its remarkable mission, and its role in the local community. The museum's staff, volunteers, trustees, and friends are passionate about the past, while at the same time, they look toward the future. I'm very pleased to join the Henry Sheldon Museum's exceptional community, and I look forward to spearheading new initiatives and a new direction for the institution in the coming months and years. This past October, the museum welcomed Allison LaCroix, the institution's new collection manager. Allison is an 8th generation Vermont and an alumna of Middlebury College. She received her MA in History and Museum Studies at Tufts University, and she comes to us from the Herrick House Museum in Washington, D.C. Allison's extensive knowledge and experience in cataloging, conservation, and preservation is exceptional, and she will undoubtedly be an asset to the Henry Sheldon Museum. Allison quickly hit the ground running, examining the Sheldon's collections and researching its catalog. Allison had some excellent ideas in the works for exhibitions next year, and her eye for Christmas decorating is second to none. Please come to the museum and see the beautiful display that she has put up. Sheldon's staff, volunteers, members, and friends look forward to working with Allison and to the invaluable work she will undoubtedly accomplish to help the Sheldon care for its collection. The Sheldon must also extend its thanks to the many college students who served the institution as interns and in a work-study capacity this past year. Emma and Anya, the museum's work-study students, provided assistance at the Sheldon's events, produced marketing materials, and contributed substantially to the museum's moth mitigation efforts. And Sarah, Middlebury College's summer museum works interns, assisted Eva in the research center, to the museum's website and social media accounts, and made several exhibitions available online. My thanks to all of these students for their hard work on behalf of the Sheldon this year. I thank you for joining us at this annual meeting this evening. 2022 was an amazing year at the Sheldon, and we look forward to making 2023 as much as a blockbuster year. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Goodness gracious. We did a lot. Appreciate that overview. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. We're indeed fortunate to welcome Christopher Ilstrup as our annual meeting speaker. He's a native of Addison County. Found out Christopher is Executive Director of Vermont Humanities, a position he's held since 2018. He previously served as Senior Philanthropic Advisor at the Vermont Community Foundation, and he's also held leadership roles at the Flynn Center for Performing Arts, Outright Vermont, Rural Vermont, and was the first Executive Director of the Pride Center of Vermont. He held an undergraduate degree from Kenyon College, Master's in Development Studies from the London School of Economics, and recently was winner of the 2022 Plan of the Year, awarded by the Vermont Planners Association. I'm very interested in hearing his talk tonight. It's titled Humanities in the Heart of the Community. So welcome, Christopher. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. I'm going to start to share my screen if I can find the right spot. Here we go. And then we'll get started. Great. I just want to clarify that it wasn't me personally that won the Vermont 2022 Plan of the Year. It was the Vermont Creative Network, on which I serve on the steering committee. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I don't want to take undue credit. Nevertheless, thank you for the kind words. I'm really excited to welcome Stephanie to Vermont's cultural sector. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to working with you closely in the coming years. I also, since his picture was up on the screen, really want to take a moment to acknowledge Bill Brooks, the former executive director of the Sheldon, who I worked with closely during my years at the Vermont Community Foundation. Bill and I actually share an alma mater, Kenyon College in Ohio, and so we have always felt pretty connected. Kenyon recruited me hard back in the late 80s. I don't think they had very many working class kids applying from Vermont in those days. And I admit that I found that the Kenyon admissions team was much more excited about me than their counterparts down the street from the Sheldon at Middlebury College. In the end, though, I think I was much happier getting out of Vermont and going to Ohio, even if, truth be told, Knox County, Ohio cornfields are really no different than Addison County, Vermont cornfields. I'd like to note, I went too quickly there, whoops. I'd also like to note that despite being rejected by Middlebury College and storming off to the land of Robert Lowell and E.L. Doctorow, in lieu of basking in the reflected glow of Robert Frost, I am very proud of being from Addison County. The cultural institutions of my childhood, growing up in Virginia, the Bixby Library, DAR State Park, Fort Ticonderoga, Mount Independence, and of course the Sheldon Museum, hold a dear and important place in my heart. And most importantly, of course, I'm now back in Vermont, where I have made a career in cultural organizing for almost 25 years. I usually really try to avoid moments like this, giving a keynote address, as I'm a firm believer that to be a humanist requires no particular expertise or credential, and one should not necessarily get a platform or an annual meeting invite to expound on a topic simply because I'm a very knowledgeable person with advanced degrees. And that's where Winnie the Pooh comes in, of course. And I'll get to him next. There he is, a very knowledgeable person with advanced degrees. I'm a bit of a contrarian, rather, and I believe that wisdom comes in many forms from many different lived experiences. And I support the notion that everyone's voice deserves to be heard, no matter who you are or where you come from, and that to be a humanist especially, even one with expertise or advanced degrees, simply requires a willingness to be in conversation with others about what it means to be part of a community. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you to take a moment and turn to the person next to you in your living room, on your couch, or just sit with yourself if you're alone, and try a little trick that I learned from my colleagues at Middlebury College's Engaged Listening Project. I want to thank Professor Sarah Stroop, who lives in Virginia, for the lesson. So turn to your neighbor or to your own thoughts and talk or think for just a moment about these two questions. What is the first cultural experience that you remember having as part of a larger community? And what did it feel like to have that experience? I'll pull us back together in 2 minutes, so don't stop paying attention to your Zoom screen. All right, I'm going to pull us back together. Sarah and the team at the Middlebury Engaged Listening Project are firm believers that creating small moments like these, where you can think a little bit about a topic or a question before you participate in a conversation like this one, can help us all to hear each other in different ways, a very important skill in these polarized days. At my organization, Vermont Humanities, we've been working hard to rethink how and why we do our work, which is often called the public humanities. Public humanities can happen in neighborhoods, parks, gardens, bars, libraries, in our faith communities. And although related, it can be quite different from its cousin, the academic humanities, such as that taught up the street at the college. That said, it seems clear to me that both the public humanists and the academic humanists are increasingly collaborating in ways that make both fields of inquiry stronger and more interesting. And I should note here that Professor Ellery Foutch of both Middlebury College and the Sheldon Museum is a great example of a humanist who works exceedingly well in both capacities, both public and academic. We often use a bit of a shorthand joke to describe our process at Vermont Humanities. We want to move away from the sage on the stage model of bearded old men like me, declaiming wisdom from the academic mountaintop. We want to move towards a model where all stories are valued in spaces both formal and informal, and where we all work together to make our communities stronger through a better understanding of our collective lived experiences. As an example of this principle in action, last week we partnered with our friends down the street at Vermont Folklife Center to offer a grassroots community training in oral history collections. Almost 100 people registered from all over Vermont. Most of them are taking part in Vermont Reads 2022, El Viaje Más Caro, The Most Costly Journey, about which more will be said a bit later in the talk. This is quite a shift from where we were as a field or a sector even 10 years ago, when academic rank was one of the most valued credentials for Humanities Council programming. And we focused our work most often on presenting scholarship from the Ivy League and similar institutions, often to the exclusion of many other voices. And while we certainly continue to value academic excellence as a key piece of our work, and you should too, we believe, and many prominent scholars also now believe, that there are many paths to wisdom, and they don't always come from the maps laid out by Harvard or Dartmouth, or dare I say it, Middlebury or Kenyon. Even our friends at the venerable National Endowment for the Humanities have redefined the term scholar to be much more inclusive of lived experience, native or indigenous wisdom, and an informal or family education, all now a valued part of the definition of a humanities scholar at the NEH. I'm deeply inspired by the work that the Sheldon Museum has done over the last several years under the label The Elephant in the Archives. And indeed, we were so inspired at Vermont Humanities that we helped to fund and promote the series of educational seminars that the Sheldon offered to the wider museum and historical society communities in Vermont and around New England. As the series organizers noted, their goal was ultimately to question the kind of history that cultural heritage organizations perpetuate, and to provide a framework for how institutions of all sizes and all resources can engage in essential conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion in museum practice. The premise of the series, indeed, is based in what we would call applied humanities. That is, how do we use the tools of humanistic inquiry to build community, strive for social justice, and make change in today's complicated moment? The Sheldon Museum may be small, but it is a leader in this work, and these are the kinds of conversations that are happening throughout our field, and not without backlash, as the recent struggles across the country to ban reading and discussion of issues of race, racism, LGBTQ+ culture, and more have demonstrated. Much to the dismay of curators and cultural workers, humanists, teachers, and librarians across the country, political efforts to shut down academic freedom, and indeed the basic freedom to read, are widespread and growing wider as fear of change creates spaces for demagoguery to thrive. The Sheldon, as a small local organization, is to be commended for stepping into this space and defending the rights of all scholars and community members to learn together without fear or intimidation. Although it is arguably safer for us in Vermont than it is in some other parts of our polarized nation, nevertheless, it is not entirely without risk. We have seen conflicts around the freedom to read and learn erupting here in Vermont no less than in many other states. Libraries and schools in Springfield, Randolph, Chester, Canaan, and other Vermont communities are beating back challenges to humanistic inquiry. And indeed, students and families in Vermont are also struggling simply for the freedom to live an unencumbered life. Across Vermont, we see families of color, LGBTQ families, and at this moment especially, transgender youth struggling to make it through the day. The power of the humanities and of the cultural sector to help alleviate some of this pain has never been more potent if we take advantage of it. For example, throughout 2020 and 2021, Vermont Humanities organized programming around Sarah Henstra's important young adult novel, We Contain Multitudes. It's about the experience of LGBTQ youth living with domestic violence in their family, a common experience even here in Vermont. The director of the Alice Ward Library in Canaan sent us a letter recently about her community's experience with the book, and I quote her here. "We are in the most rural and remote part of Vermont. It is sparsely populated and there is not a lot of diversity in population. Reading We Contain Multitudes together showed our community, especially those who may or may not be openly LGBTQ identified, that the library is an inclusive, welcoming place for everyone. Our K through 12 school library, not the public library, had a book challenge last spring from a vocal group of parents who objected to LGBTQ books. The school administration, the supervisory union, and the school boards upheld the books unanimously through a series of appeals, and the books remain in the school library today. When this happened, many people rushed to the public library because it was known that we owned these books and others like them. We circulated the 3 challenged books widely during those weeks, and I am certain that because we read We Contain Multitudes together as a community, people know that the library is an ally. We are now seen as a safe place for new, accurate, and safe resources to read. And I truly believe having these conversations is the beginning of thinking about others who may not have our lived experience in a rural place. I was so grateful for the opportunity to work with this wonderful, well-written, and special book. Back to me, my voice. The Sheldon, like many regional history museums, has been a living and breathing example of how to tell diverse stories for many generations. Even if it is relatively recent that we have begun to look for the deep cuts or the empty spaces, the so-called elephants in the archives. As a collector, Mr. Sheldon, like Mr. Fairbanks in St. Johnsbury and Mrs. Webb up in Shelburne, was nothing if not eclectic and diverse. The Sheldon Museum's archives are vast and impressive and are only now beginning to be fully understood and publicly presented in a modern context through the diligent work of the scholars in the Stuart Swift archives. New research findings, like those of scholars Eva Garcelin-Hart and Rachel Hope Cleaves working on the Charity and Sylvia archives, are changing our understanding of what life and community was like in Addison County in Vermont's early years. Their work is demonstrating that diversity, equity, and inclusion are not new concepts or new discussions for Vermonters, but that indeed there has been significant diversity and support for differences in our small towns and villages for generations, going back to the earliest days of the Vermont Republic and our 1791 admission to the Union as the 14th state. Scholar Bill Hart and artist Katie Rundy Sanchez are also showing the power of the humanities to speak to current issues. Katie's monumental painting of Middlebury graduate Alexander Twilight, the first man of African descent elected to the Vermont legislature, is now hanging with pride of place in the Vermont State House, demonstrating to legislators, tourists, and thousands of visiting school children that Black Americans are indeed part of Vermont's story. The power of visibility and representation cannot be understated. The stories of Charity and Sylvia, the early female couple in Orwell documented in the Sheldon's archives, and of Alexander Twilight, the first Black legislator in Vermont, are powerful examples of inclusion in Vermont's story. Other Vermonters, both those working in academia and those working as independent scholars, are using local historical archives like the Sheldons to uncover stories about Native Vermonters' experiences, early feminist leaders, and the beginnings of the environmental movement, researching our forebears' interactions with our ecosystem and our climate. In just one example, farmers' records of first frost and last snowfall are wildly useful in understanding the progression of man-made climate change from the 19th century to today. The weather records at St. Johnsbury's Fairbanks Museum are vital to understanding the changing climate of the Northeast Kingdom. All of this helps us to understand why the arts, cultural studies, and the humanities are such important disciplines to continue to support in 2022 and beyond, when there has been such an effort to drive a wedge between humanists and those who are working in science and technology. Over and over, from the New York Times to Fox News, we hear about humanities disciplines that are struggling to stay relevant in the face of the pressure brought to bear by those who would prioritize the STEM fields, or those who simply don't support or understand humanistic inquiry. Even in Vermont, we see concerted efforts to underfund humanities scholarship in our state institutions, somehow justifying the results by pointing to greater investments in so-called money-making fields. I would argue that this zero-sum game is short-sighted and loses track of the importance of critical thinking, writing, and research skills that are taught across the humanities disciplines. Pundits are rationalizing attacks on culture and the humanities by claiming that perhaps the only metric of importance or success is how much a young person will be able to pull down from a corporate salary to pay back tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. Philosophy majors and lovers of French poetry are the frequent butts of jokes and targets of politicians seeking to tear down those who are interested in useless degrees that apparently lead only to dead-end jobs as baristas at Starbucks. And while I did work as a barista for 4 months in 1991, I think my mom would agree with me that the investment in a Kenyan education actually had pretty good results. At Vermont Humanities, of course, we don't subscribe to this simplistic narrative of us versus them, humanities versus STEM. And we don't think there are very many people working in STEM fields who believe in this narrative either. Every day we talk to coders who are thinking about the ethical ramifications of our technological advancements, to medical professionals who understand that empathy is at the core of their ability to advance health equity, and engineers who demonstrate that the structures they build serve communities made up of real people, and that those structures must be built using universal design principles grounded in the humanities. And of course, there are thousands of climate scientists who know that those most deeply affected by the climate crisis will be the most marginalized human communities around the world. All of these fields require skilled use of humanistic inquiry in order to advance our understanding of science, technology, engineering, and math. Scientists know this, of course. Many politicians and pundits, however, don't seem to have received the memo. As we say in our mission statement, using the humanities, we connect with people across Vermont to create just, vibrant, and resilient communities, and to inspire a lifelong love of learning. And when we say people, we truly mean all people, not just those who read poetry, love Chaucer, reenact the Battle of Bennington, or trace the genealogy of French, English, or Abenaki ancestors. We mean everyone. We believe that the humanities are tools for change, not a set of books on a shelf, and we are reimagining our work by making equity, accessibility, and accountability central to everything that we do, much as the Sheldon Museum is doing by finding those elephants and reinterpreting your collections in the light of untold stories that are not only about generals like Benedict Arnold or colonists like Ethan Allen, but rather are about everyday people living everyday lives that sometimes become extraordinary when viewed through a new lens, including those two women building a life together in 19th century Orwell, or a young man of African descent building a school for local children where there previously had been no opportunities at all for formal learning. The humanities really truly are at the heart of every community, and it is imperative that we understand how our cultural sector supports that community building and makes Vermont a place that we want to live in. Vermont Humanities is a member of the steering committee for the Vermont Creative Network, which recently built the Create Vermont Action Plan, with participation from thousands of Vermonters in every corner of the state, maybe even you. Indeed, this plan is such a compelling vision for arts, culture, and creativity at the heart of Vermont that it was recognized as the 2022 Plan of the Year by the Vermont Planners Association, not a group of people that have traditionally had a reputation for interests beyond roundabouts and recruiting manufacturers. That said, of course, I don't want to demean planners at all. They are often found at the forefront of community building work that truly integrates arts and culture into a community conversation about what makes a livable place. The recognition of the plan, however, is, I would argue, a recognition by many Vermonters that culture and creativity are critical components in Vermont's efforts to rebound from the pandemic and attract new and engaged people to our aging state. Culture and creativity, such as that offered by the Sheldon Museum, the Vermont Folklife Center, the Ilsley Public Library, and the many artist studios and local food producers in the core of Middlebury, should be nurtured and cultivated. They are economic drivers that enhance our community in a way that big box development and suburban sameness never will. As the plan says, creativity and innovation are the heart of Vermont's strength. And when we invest in our creative sector, it can pave the way for a thriving, equitable future. At 9.3%, Vermont has a greater share of creative sector jobs than the US average. The majority of those jobs are in design, specialty foods, and visual arts and crafts, but nearly 50% of Vermont's creatives are self-employed or freelance, compared to 40% nationwide. From Bennington to Barton, creative people, projects, and enterprises are everywhere. As an aside, I'm going to note here that the Sheldon has a ringer in the planning process. Sheldon trustee Kelly Hickey, who I think is in the webinar, is the zone agent or community leader for Addison and Rutland counties as we implement the Create Vermont Action Plan. I would like to offer my thanks to Kelly publicly in this venue for her service to both the Sheldon and to the wider vision for Vermont's creative and cultural sector. The plan continues. Our state's reputation for innovation is a vital part of the Vermont brand, attracting tourists and entrepreneurs, driving economic growth, and anchoring vibrant communities. Creative people, businesses, and ideas are key to helping Vermont recover from the COVID-19 pandemic to address major challenges like racism, climate change, and affordability. Just like roads and bridges, creativity and innovation are essential infrastructure for Vermont's future. At 9.3% of Vermont's jobs, 41,000 Vermonters are employed in cultural or creative sector enterprises. And that includes libraries, museums, arts organizations, single proprietor artists and creative shops, specialty food producers, and more. These people are truly at the core of everything that we currently think of as Vermont's humanities infrastructure. These workers, by which I mean to say you, live in each and every one of our communities. And the plan states unequivocally that we believe that creativity is essential to the cultural and economic vitality of Vermont. There are three overarching goals for the plan. The first, arts, culture, and creativity are essential Vermont infrastructure. And we believe that creative enterprises must have equitable access to robust public, private, and community funding and resources. That educational systems in Vermont should develop creative talent, skills, access to, and appreciation for arts and culture, and that state and local policies should be designed to equitably support creative enterprises and infrastructure. Second, that Vermont communities thrive through creative expression and enterprises. That communities are infused with, that communities and enterprises have access to robust public, private, and community resources. That creative people and enterprises have abundant access to the resources they need to succeed. That vibrant networks support creative people and industries and communities of practice. And that Vermont is promoted as a hub for creative talent, experiences, and communities. Finally, Vermont communities thrive through creative expression and enterprise. Communities should be infused with opportunities for creative economic development, expression, and engagement. Creative people should be engaged in community building and leadership across the economy and across our communities. And cross-sector collaborations should amplify creativity and local economies. Our advocacy agenda at the State House and at the federal level, including encouraging investment in creative spaces and infrastructure, expanding creative economic development to invest in broadband and digital capacity for creative enterprises, and to develop creative business skills. So as people who care about the cultural and creative sector and people who support the mission of the Sheldon Museum to tell complicated and complex stories about the history and present day experience of people living in Addison County, I urge you to support the implementation of the Create Vermont Action Plan. Vermont Humanities is supporting the plan in myriad ways, through funding individual cultural institutions like the Sheldon, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, and the Clements Family Farm, but also through building the capacity of Vermonters to be leaders in their community. In the last 2 years, we have offered significant support to our partners at the Vermont Council on Rural Development for a COVID Recovery Leadership Summit, to the Vermont Creative Network to support local leadership development, including professional support for zone agents like Kelly, to the Snelling Center for Government's Vermont Leadership Institute and Vermont School Leadership Institute, and to the Center for Cartoon Studies for their Freedom and Unity comic book on the practice of democracy in Vermont. That comic book, by the way, was produced in partnership with Vermont Humanities, but also with the Vermont Secretary of State's office. We have also been supporting the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative for their work with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Vermonters. And all of this intentionally brings the humanities into the heart of our communities and serves as a guiding principle for community development. I know we're going to move towards a conversation in just a couple of moments, so I want to close by briefly returning to a project that I mentioned earlier in the talk. Centered in Addison County, the anthology El Viaje Más Caro, or The Most Costly Journey, is an excellent example of the humanities in action. We'll let this story take us home. El Viaje marks the 20th year of Vermont Reads, a Vermont Humanities signature and award-winning program where we encourage Vermonters of all ages to read one book together and take action in their community around the themes of the book. In 2020, Vermont Reads March by Congressman John Lewis won national recognition for outstanding public humanities programming in state and jurisdictional humanities councils. But we're not resting on our laurels. We believe that Vermont Reads 2022, The Most Costly Journey, will be even more impactful in Vermont communities. So far, over 200 different towns, 80% of Vermont have participated in Vermont Reads since it began in 2003. We often promoted nationally or internationally known authors like Angie Thomas, Salman Rushdie, Harper Lee, Robert Frost, or of course, Congressman John Lewis. But The Most Costly Journey is a little bit different. It sprang from a collaboration between 6 Vermont organizations, including the Open Door Clinic, a federally qualified healthcare center just down the street here in Middlebury, and the Vermont Folklife Center, right next door to the Sheldon Museum. It is the first bilingual Vermont Reads book, and it tells the stories of 19 Vermont farm workers from Latin America in their own words. Illustrated by New England cartoonists, each short chapter describes aspects of life as a migrant farm worker in Vermont. And we have been partnering with Inclusive Arts Vermont to produce an audiobook version of many of the stories to improve accessibility. There are already 70 community projects in progress all across the state, and we expect many more communities will take part before the program year ends on June 30th, 2023. 3,500 copies of the book have already been distributed across Vermont, and your neighbors at the Open Door Clinic and Vermont Folklife have been presenting about the work all over the state. This is all very cool, of course, and we love it that so many Vermonters are taking advantage of this opportunity to learn about and support their neighbors working on farms across the state. It's a tremendous opportunity for organizing in support of better working conditions for farmers and farm workers, and to build a greater understanding of the effort that it takes to maintain the Vermont landscape that we all know and love, especially here in Addison County. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this project started at the Open Door Clinic as a health equity project. Do you remember when I said earlier that we know that medical professionals understand the power of the humanities to build health equity and offer real opportunities for individuals to live a better and healthier life? Nurse practitioner Julia Grand-Doucette, one of your neighbors, works primarily with undocumented and uninsured farm workers in Addison County. These workers were presenting terrible physical manifestations of the stress and isolation that is inherent in being separated from your family, your culture, your community, and your language, while working long hours in dangerous conditions with often substandard housing. Part of Julia's solution was storytelling. She reasoned that if farm workers could tell their stories, and if others would listen, that isolation and depression could be addressed and people's health would begin to improve. Julia was right. Her initial thought was that collecting, illustrating, and distributing migrant farm worker stories would help the collective group, some 1,200 to 2,000 resident farm workers, primarily from Mexico and Guatemala. She believed it would help them to gain knowledge and access to physical and mental health services. And she was right. It did do this. The original Spanish language stories were wildly popular, easy to reproduce on a copy machine and leave at locations all over Addison County where migrant farm workers were likely to find them. What she didn't count on was the dramatic improvement in the health of the storytellers themselves. The simple fact of being asked to tell their story and of being listened to in a respectful and thoughtful manner led to better health outcomes all around. Today, with the stories translated into English and anthologized as a collection, Vermonters of all stripes have the opportunity to engage with these voices, hopefully creating more empathy for our neighbors and a greater sense of urgency around immigration reform and support for Vermont's struggling dairy industry. The storytellers and comic book artists of El Viaje Más Caro, The Most Costly Journey, along with the healthcare providers at the Open Door Clinic and the oral historians at Vermont Folklife, have truly created a magical tool to make change possible in the heart of our communities. And that, my friends, is the power of the humanities in our state. Thank you very much. We're going to take a few minutes now to have a conversation.
Christopher, thank you so much. This is a exhilarating presentation that just, I think, hammers home the importance of connection and ways of making meaning in the world. And I love this evocation of the humanities as a kind of infrastructure and support for communities that's a vital need. And that is maybe also a necessity for human life, the human in the humanities, not just healthcare as a human right, but the humanities as a human right almost. I hope that our participants will start populating the Q&A with your own comments and questions or issues you would like to hear Christopher's take on and to address. So please do I know that some of you are maybe already typing your questions in that box, but I'm so moved by this very generous talk and vision for a better Vermont as well. And I think this also, I was really struck at the opening of your talk by the evocation of the challenges we face in this historical moment and how difficult the many kind of hurdles we're facing. And I was wondering if you could maybe share with us a bit about how you keep hope or where you find hope. You sketched out some really great initiatives and projects. I'd just love to hear some more.
That's a really great question. And it was actually asked of a colleague of mine, Susan Clark, who is the town meeting moderator for Middlesex, Vermont, and the researcher who is responsible for a lot of the basic premise of the Freedom and Unity comic book that we put together over the last year with the Center for Cartoon Studies. There's a lot going on in democracy right now that can be really discouraging. Right? We all know what it is. We don't need to hammer it. It is not an elephant in the room. It is elephants all over the place. And she was asked, how do you find hope in work to promote democracy? And she actually said, and I'm totally stealing this from her with credit, but because it really resonated with me. She said she doesn't find hope to be a particularly useful emotion because it is, in Buddhist thought, the flip side of fear. And so she said that rather than think about what gives her hope, she simply thinks about what she can do when she gets up every day that will help democracy to thrive in that moment. And I think that's very wise, that what we need to be thinking about as humanists and as people who care about democracy is what can we do each and every day in small ways and big ways to help make sure that people understand the importance of democracy in our communities. When you read Freedom and Unity, which by the way, you can read in full, you can download it from the Center for Cartoon Studies website. And if you want printed copies, you can give me a shout and I'm happy to send them. We have 20,000 copies. There's plenty. You'll see that the book is filled with those tiny little ways that might generate hope. It's true, they might generate hope because they're cool things to do, but that really are just moments that we can have every day where we participate in making decisions in our community. Some of it might be serving on a nonprofit board. Some of it might be joining your local co-op or your local credit union. It might be encouraging your kids to be part of a youth advisory council. It might be supporting your kids to succeed in being part of that youth advisory council. And of course, it's about voting, right? And supporting that piece of democracy. But democracy is much bigger than voting. Democracy is countless hundreds of tiny actions that we take every day to participate in our communities and make them a better place.
That's so lovely. This emphasis on focusing on the kind of tangible, actionable items, as it were, as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I see we do have an open question. Bill Hart comments, who you invoked in your talk as well. Excellent talk, Christopher. Thank you so much. So often I hear about my work on Vermont history, on a Vermont history topic, that my work is regional. I respond that as microhistory, my stories reflect national cultural trends and impulses. How do you respond to criticism that Vermont history is often viewed as regional and thus lesser than national history? Thanks, from Bill Hart.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah. I guess my response to that, I'm going to invoke the comic book again, honestly, the Freedom and Unity comic, because people have said similar things to me. They're like, oh, this comic book, it's so great, but it's so specific to Vermont. It couldn't possibly be relevant to Mississippi or New Jersey or California. It's, we're special in Vermont. And I think we have this terrible, terrible tendency to actually believe our own propaganda, that we are special, that we are somehow an exceptional place that is different than anywhere else and thus not relevant to national stories or even international stories. And I think that's crazy talk, to be quite honest. I think, sure, we're special, but we're special in the same way that everybody is special, in that we all have our own unique stories, we all have our own unique communities, and we all have different ways in which we practice the humanities, we practice history, we practice democracy. And I think we can learn lessons from people that are practicing democracy differently from us in Alabama or Mississippi or Florida, just as they can learn from how we do our work here in Vermont. One of the great things about the seat that I sit in as the executive director of Vermont Humanities is that I am deeply enmeshed in the network of public humanists of the humanities councils in the 54 state and territorial jurisdictions around the country, right, including the Virgin Islands and the Marianas and Guam and so on. And what I learn every time I am with my colleagues is that we surely all have different experiences, but at the root, we all struggle with the same issues. And certainly with Bill's work around Alexander Twilight, those stories appear everywhere, right? Alexander Twilight is not special to Vermont. He is a Vermonter. But his story is not special to here. There are similar stories of people who swam upstream to create something good for their community anywhere you go. And so, of course, Alexander Twilight's story is relevant in Maryland and in California. There are going to be analogs in other places. And I think it's important that we actually map those analogs so we understand and can raise up those stories across the country, and not let people say that we're different and we don't count.
Beautiful. I think, yeah, again, I'm reminded of the emphasis on the human of the humanities, and that sense of connection. And I think this is reminding me too a bit of Henry Sheldon's collection, which I sometimes think of as, or which I often hear described as this kind of local history nugget of just this small county in rural Vermont. And yet it has this really global span and reach. And I think there are ways, both big and small, that we can think about whether they're the big questions that we're grappling with about looking for hope or looking for democracy to continue, or struggling for how we meet our basic needs and our needs for connection as well, that can be kind of explored in these ways. I'm struck too by your evocation of public art in some ways, or the format of the zine and this kind of guerrilla work of the comic and the public distribution of stories, which really takes it out of that rarefied air of the library or the museum, and instead brings it to the street. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about some of the initiatives that you see developing this way, or maybe even the kind of media or formats that you imagine enabling this kind of, I'm imagining this kind of network or fissure of connections happening.
Yeah, and I want to just do another shout out to the Folklife Center and Andy Kolovos, your next door neighbor, who has really helped broaden my understanding of some of these material culture objects that are made to be disposable, right? Comic books are not made to last. They're ephemera. You're supposed to read them and then throw them in the recycling bin and then they're gone. And so often I think things like that, things like zines, don't get the kind of scholarly attention or serious attention that probably they should, right? And the Julia at Open Door Clinic decided to do comics, not because she was herself particularly a fan of comic books, and she'll say this and then Andy will smack her, but because she knew that in Latin America, there is a tradition of using comic books for social change. And that comes from the work of Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and many of the activists and community organizers that come out of that tradition that used things like comic books for low literacy communities to spread messages of social change. And so she knew that format would resonate with the farm workers that she was working with, and she was right. And she originally had no intention of translating them into English. That was not a thing in the original project. It was only quite a number of years later that I'll be blunt, white folks started to notice that this was kind of a cool thing, and they wanted to know about it, and they couldn't read it in Spanish. So that's when they started to raise money for the English translations. But I think that's true in across any number of fields. We talk about this particular public health project, but I also think Andy organized recently a nonfiction comic books festival up in Burlington, where he brought in a lot of people who were doing zines in the punk rock scene in the 1980s and 1990s. And that is, if you have those things now, it's an amazing record of a really important really important moment in music history. and the way that young people were just, collaging the heck out of Xerox pieces of paper to tell their story of what they were feeling during that time. So I think, there are dozens, if not thousands, of examples of the way that that kind of disposable material culture is in and of itself humanistic inquiry, that helps us find meaning, find a place, find a community to be a part of, that doesn't rely on formal structures, but is entirely informal.
I love this. And I feel like we're establishing this kind of kindred spirit connection with Henry Sheldon across the years here. When you bring up the idea of ephemera, I know Lucinda must be cheering, because Henry Sheldon was such an avid collector of not just the papers or important objects and artifacts connected to important people, with the most prominent, politicians or military leaders, but he was also he somehow had the vision to see ahead the importance of the everyday person, of the working man, of those at the margins of society, and hold on to their dance cards, their programs from amateur theatricals, and things like that, so that we can tell this story of these kind of works of resistance to the hegemony or the major narrative, that we can tell those stories today about the past and hopefully make a connection to the present.
It just, Ellery just thought of another beautiful example that I think people should visit from Middlebury if they can at all. There's an amazing place in the Northeast Kingdom just when you cross over into Glover called the Museum of Everyday Life. It's run by an incredible person, wonderful artist, Claire, and her exhibit this year is about lists, L-I-S-T-S. I'm not, like shopping lists, and that's literally what it is, right? Is a whole exhibit that she has curated about people's lists and notes, and it has beautiful things and scary things and terrifying things and amazing memories that are encapsulated in these little scraps of paper that she has arranged on the wall to tell the story of people's lives in the Northeast Kingdom and in other places. And she was a person who was very involved in bread and puppet theater. And after Elke Schumann's, the co-founder's passing, she was helping Peter, her husband, to clear out. And there were piles and piles of Elke's notes. And so, she's part of the exhibit is pinned on the wall is the set list for one of the bread and puppet circuses, one of the last big public circuses, I think the last big public circus in 1998. But next to that was a 5-gallon bucket with a little handwritten note, masking tape to it from Elke that just said, "Peanut butter, old but still good." And it just says to me so much about who Elke was as a person, and what Bread and Puppet is as an entity, that little scrap of paper stayed taped to that 5-gallon bucket of old but still good peanut butter for who knows, 20 years, 30, 40? How long would Elke have still eaten that peanut butter? Probably a very long time. And then it goes on, and there's lots of kind of incredible stories, but one of the last pieces in the exhibit is a handwritten bucket list of a teenager from Hardwick of all of the things that he wanted to do in his life that was found after he committed suicide, and all of the lost opportunity for that young person, and the demonstration of how we fail our young people frequently was really very touching. So, all of this stuff is so important in finding true stories about who we are as a community and how we relate to each other as people.
Absolutely.
And the Charity and Sylvia archives are just remarkable in showing us that these conversations are not new.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this way of finding the profound in what might seem to be very quotidian. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Robert Black. Thank you, Christopher, for your heartfelt commitment to shaping more human and humane communities. On the subject of humanities versus STEM, what are a couple of practical strategies you found to encourage the inclusion of humanities in shaping broader curricular development and inspiring more open attitudes of teachers in K-12 schools and institutions of higher learning?
Yeah, you know, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think that the versus is manufactured. I think it's a manufactured crisis that is made up by pundits and certain journalist organizations with an agenda and politicians. And I think when you actually talk to scientists and engineers and you bring them together in the same room with humanities professionals, you find that there's a lot more agreement on the need for integrated educational systems than there is any sort of desire to tear down or separate the STEM disciplines from the arts and humanities disciplines. I think that is functionally true across the board in almost all institutions, but there's a tremendous pressure to prove economic value. And it has somehow been decided by folks with budgetary decision-making power that humanities fields have less economic oomph than STEM fields. And there's some data that might show that, but I think there's also a lot more data that shows you can be a much more successful doctor if you have a humanities background as well. And so I think we just have to keep talking about it. And we have to keep saying that this is not an us versus them, that this is not a battle to the finish until the last classics department falls. I think that's not the way to approach it. I think the way to approach it is through partnership and collaboration.
Absolutely. This reminds me too of an initiative. I know this is happening at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Collaborations between art museums and medical schools to bring in medical students to look at works of art and share their observations and the ways in which they find that enhances their powers of observation and skills of articulation, as well as building empathy and an appreciation for some of the beauty or tragedy in the human experience. So,
yeah. And I would imagine we have a lot to learn from medical students too.
absolutely.
You know, in fact, I just had a meeting with Dr. Jan Carney, who's the head of the Larner College of Medicine at UVM, about, you know, are there ways that we can partner, Vermont Humanities can partner with the College of Medicine, and we're going to start small, and she's going to give us a couple of medical students to think with us about rejuvenating our literature and medicine program, which has been kind of puttering along at a, you know, very low rate for a bunch of years now, but I think could really actually make a big difference if it was being used in more federally qualified health centers like the Open Door Clinic. So I'm excited to work with those med students and see what they have to say.
Yeah, and I'm so heartened too by this reminder that this is an artificial constructed divide. The ways in which, for example, the American artist Thomas Eakins did some of his most productive work in collaboration with Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia by attending their anatomy classes, or the ways that Charles Wilson Peale, the founder of the first museum in the United States, considered himself as much of an enthusiast for and expert in natural history preserving the taxidermied birds and specimens of mastodons and things like that, as painting the artists of or as an artist painting portraits of the leaders of the American Revolution. So I think this, if we can look for that permeability again, maybe this would be so striking.
Yeah,
I'd love
the Fairbanks Museum is a great example as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I should tag in my colleague Lucinda Cockrell at this moment, but Christopher, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure, such a delight.
Thank you for having me, Lucinda and Stephanie, and all of you. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Christopher. What a thought-provoking, wow. I learned a lot, and thank you for all that overview of Creative Vermont Action Plan and bringing the Sheldon in so many ways, and people that we all have that we know and are intermingled. It's fascinating. So it's given us a lot to work with, to go with, and think about. And so thank you very, very much. I'm glad that you decided to speak with us tonight and not sit in the back seat. So thank you, Christopher. And thanks to all the staff this evening who made this meeting possible, the presentations, and thank you to the members and friends here joining us tonight, and for your continued support of the Sheldon Museum and for your community spirit. And please check our website for upcoming events and programs. You know what it is, www.henrysheldonmuseum.org. More holiday train exhibits, and the exhibits that Stephanie outlined to you are still up. Artists in the Archives and the Addison County Collects. There's more midnight strolls coming up December the 8th and the 15th. There's another Artists in the Archives talk, as Stephanie said, on December the 14th. And there's Christmas tree raffles and such. So please stop by the museum during the holidays. We'd love to see you. Again, thank you for joining us, and there be no further business. The Henry Sheldon Museum annual membership meeting is adjourned, but we have at this time, please, the Sheldon Board of Trustees should remain on this Zoom so that we will have an election of our officers. So thank you all very much.